thank you very much for the invitation. It's a privilege to present at this conference. The main objective of this presentation is going to be to provide microeconomic input to the discussion on mobility as a service and primarily on pricing and industrial organization related questions within MaaS. At the beginning of a MaaS presentation, I think people normally try to provide kind of a definition of mobility as a service. There is no single consensual definition. In our view, MaaS is essentially the mix of an earlier trend in terms of promoting multimodal solutions, and then we try to mix it with some recent developments in terms of the success of sharing economy, and finally add some emerging IT solutions in order to make it even more consumable and more attractive for the consumer. This overall system of these three pillars is what makes mobility as a service so successful in the policy arena as well as in research. However, this concept includes a number of new policy proposals that might be highly relevant for welfare economics. And the first one is on the side of pricing. In the MaaS framework, we can see a number of new tariff structures, much more than the usual flat fares or the usual distance dependence fares that were present in the public transport industry for a while. But new tariff products are also emerging, for example, mobility packages or multimodal subscriptions that might be available for multiple transport modes within a given period of time, or bundles of existing travel permits. And the second big area where there are new developments is industrial organization. We have heard a lot about the new agency, which is often called the MaaS integrator. These are two new items that are highly relevant for transport economics as well. And in this sense, the main goal of this presentation is to somehow bridge the gap between the transport economics community and the community surrounding mobility as a service, which on the academic side is mainly the demand modeling group of researchers. The early scientific results and evidence that we already have are mainly from demand modeling experiments, which means that we do know a lot about how people and users would react to MaaS related interventions. But as we have heard in the last 2 days, the knowledge is much fewer and much more scarce when it comes to supply side policies. We don't really know what capacities should be provided under a MaaS framework. How would that affect the frequency, the size of public transport supply? How many shared cars should be provided in a shared service? And finally, and probably most importantly, what would be the price of this service? Of course, the price will determine to a large extent what demand will emerge for MaaS related products. And therefore, the optimization of pricing is going to be one of the crucial factors when it comes to the successful implementation of mobility as a service. This presentation has a very conservative approach in the sense that we try to derive everything from a standard welfare economics approach. We try to have an objective function which is as transparent as possible. We try to define the decision variables of the pricing problem, of the capacity allocation problem, and things like that, and then use mathematical modeling, quantitative tools to derive some policy conclusions. However, before I jump into the details of our modeling experiment, let me just quickly summarize the main conclusions of this paper, the main takeaways. The number one is that ideally, in case of public transport, no matter if it's within the MaaS framework or outside of it, ideally kind of a temporally, spatially, and directionally differentiated pricing system would be the most efficient in order to reflect the variations in terms of the social cost of traveling in the public transport system and in any other modes. That doesn't change with the introduction of mobility as a service. Unfortunately, we also find that subscription type of tariff products and travel permits have some disadvantages welfare economics properties The first one, that those who are buying these products are unfortunately over-consuming the surplus, the service, which means that the fare they are facing is practically zero, while the social cost of traveling is rarely zero, and therefore they receive a wrong incentive, which might lead to sometimes wasteful trips. The second main finding in terms of subscriptions is that those who are actually not buying the subscription are likely to become more reliant on their private cars, which will eventually generate two groups of captive users. One group will be a captive subscription holder and public transport group of users, and the second group is unfortunately a captive car user group. The third finding is that MaaS, and especially the IT solutions in the MaaS ecosystem, provide nice solutions in order to implement differentiated pricing. So basically implement what we suggest in the first item. And therefore it is surprising to some extent that subscription and aggregate tariff products are a bit more popular in the MaaS concept, or at least in many contributions related to the MaaS concept. In terms of industrial organization, our conclusion is primarily that whenever we talk about new industrial organization and new institutional setups, we have to clarify always what objective function is ahead of us and how that objective can be pursued by a given industrial setup. And finally, a last conclusion of this presentation is going to be that during the COVID-19 crisis, due to an increase in a number of social costs linked to public transport use, it is becoming more and more important to provide the right incentives for users, and therefore this reinforces our findings in the sense that differentiated pricing is a better way forward instead of subscriptions and passes. So how do we reach these conclusions? I'll try to begin with a very simple relationship, what economic theory suggests, and this is essentially that in any mode of transport, the optimal fare or the optimal price or the optimal toll is simply the gap between the net marginal social cost of traveling and what users actually perceive in the form of personal user costs. And let me just explain what we have exactly on the right-hand side of this simple equation. And let me begin with the marginal personal cost, because that's much easier. Demand modelers will be absolutely familiar with the items that normally appear under the term personal cost of public transport use. These are simply access and egress or walking related costs. There is, of course, waiting, which is closely related to the frequency of service provision. We have in-vehicle travel time costs, of course, and a huge determinant of that in-vehicle travel time cost is going to be the crowding discomfort and the related user costs. And finally, there is, of course, a transfer cost if we consider a bigger public transport network. So that's the final item. That's the marginal personal cost in this simple equation. Figuring out the net marginal social cost is a lot trickier, unfortunately. There might be a range of social implications as a result of a public transport trip. Maybe the net marginal social cost is not even the best expression for this. It might be more appropriate to say the net welfare effect, because not just social cost, but social benefits might also appear as a result of a public transport trip. Now, in the past couple of decades, there was a huge flood of research looking into the social cost of public transport use. Some of these costs are happening without any sort of capacity adjustment as a result of the marginal trip. The number one nowadays is considered to be the crowding discomfort, which is unfortunately an externality. One public transport user generates a crowding discomfort externality for fellow travelers, and this has a negative impact on social welfare. And we often tend to underestimate the importance of crowding in public transport. We often believe that it's only the car which produces externalities. When it comes to user externalities imposed on other travelers, crowding is an extremely voluminous social cost of public transport use. And if there is a negative externality, then it means that to some extent the fare, the price of using public transport should reflect this externality and vary in line with the magnitude of crowding. A second social cost component is the externality that boarding and alighting passengers impose on other users. Once again, a negative externality, which should have a positive impact on the optimal fare. Then we have opposite forces affecting the optimal price. First one is indeed substitution with underpriced car use. It has been discussed many times today that maybe car use and the price of car use doesn't reflect the true cost of this kind of mobility. And if there is substitution between public transport and car use, then public transport fares might play kind of a second best role. They should try to attract car users into public transport. And indeed, many of the MaaS related initiatives are trying to intensify this mechanism and attract and induce mode shift from car use to public transport, which is a correct intention. And finally, we also have wider economic benefits, which are stemming from the fact that mobility improves productivity throughout urban areas. And then we have a second group of social costs. These are more closely related to capacity expansion. In the peak, if you have to increase your capacities, then it might be extremely costly for the public transport operator because that capacity will remain in operation throughout the whole day. So there is a huge social cost on the side of operational expenditures. However, there are also benefits from capacity expansion, primarily due to the fact that more people implies higher frequencies that reduces the waiting time for all other users, and this can be considered and was considered as a positive externality since the 1970s when Herbert Moring wrote an influential paper about this externality. And finally, we have another social cost component, which is simply coming from the public transport operators' need for public funds. If those funds must be generated through taxation, then indeed providing $1 of subsidy costs more than $1 for society as a whole, and that should also be taken into account when one derives the optimal pricing policy for public transport. Okay, so this is a long list, and it might not be obvious how we can synthesize all these 7 or 8 potential determinants of the optimal fare. We try to illustrate this in a recently published paper where we threw everything, all these potential determinants of optimal supply, the fare and the frequency, what you have on the horizontal axis in terms of trains per hour. And what the graph does is essentially that it checks the sensitivity of optimal supply with respect to key parameters of a large model that I don't have time to explain in details. What you can see here that the agglomeration elasticity, which captures the productivity benefits of mobility, the tax revenue premium, which is essentially the cost of providing the subsidies, people's sensitivity to crowding, as well as the presence of scale economies in operational costs. These are all important parameters of a proper supply model for public transport. And either of these parameters can have a substantial effect on both the fares and the capacity which is provided for users. And of course, as a result of these supply variables, subsidies might also vary on a wide range depending on the actual values of these parameters in a particular city. So this already highlights the difficulty of setting supply for public transport, which may also explain why research is so scarce in the context of MaaS and the optimal supply in that framework. Another conclusion is that some of these parameters will vary by time of day. In the morning peak, necessarily the crowding effects are much higher than in an off-peak period, but even in the peak, or spatially and directionally, there might be huge fluctuations in terms of demand. which tells us that one value for the public transport fare, for example, won't be sufficient to achieve efficiency. The optimal fare varies by time of day, by direction, and by the location within the network. Okay, so far we have just talked about the fare, and it was one variable, one value. There are in the literature more complex tariff systems where the passenger can actually choose from a menu of different tariff products. In the simplest case, we can talk of a single ticket, a usage-dependent pay-as-you-go fare versus kind of a subscription that you have to buy for a given duration of time. And within that duration, traveling is practically for free. This is the simplest case of what we call non-uniform pricing. And there are, of course, a lot more complicated versions of this kind of menu provision within the tariff system. So this has also a very extensive literature dating back to the 1980s. Outside the transport field, it was discovered very quickly that this sort of non-uniform pricing is a nice way to price discriminate, to select certain and target certain groups of users with dedicated prices or dedicated tariff products, and this way generate revenues, which means that for a profit-oriented company, providing usage-dependent fees and subscriptions at the same time might be profitable. Then the next step was to realize that, okay, this theory can be adopted for public transport operators as well, who might be revenue constrained, in which case kind of a revenue generating power might be useful. This is what's explained in a model by José Carbajo in 1988. The next step was delivered by Sergio Jara-Díaz, who was looking into how subscriptions might perform in Santiago de Chile, and he found that it is essentially a progressive policy, so low-income groups should rely on subscriptions, but he didn't include important externalities in his model. For example, there was no crowding cost at all in that 2016 paper. Then the next important input comes from the road pricing literature. Judith Wong published a paper in which she investigated subscriptions for car use, and she realized that with the congestion externality, the efficiency of subscription is a lot worse than otherwise. And we have adopted their model recently for the case of public transport. All right, so the unexplored questions. Assume we have subscriptions. Are they helpful in order to induce mode shift? Are they helpful in order to reduce car ownership and car use? And if we put that into the context of mobility as a service, can we answer some basic questions? How a future MaaS operator will set the prices of these types of tariff products? What capacity policies will complement a new MaaS-oriented tariff system? And in general, is this whole story beneficial for society? Will that increase consumers' benefits? Does it produce a positive net present value, if you want to use the terminology of cost-benefit analysis? We are developing a simple model to answer these questions. The model has two directions, so basically two markets served by the same capacity, the same way as in reality when a public transport line is subject to directional demand imbalances. On the demand side of the model, our consumers who we will simulate will make three decisions. First of all, on whether to own a car or not. Second, they make decisions on whether to buy a subscription for a given amount of time or not. And finally, on a daily level, they make mode choice decisions. So this is essentially a discrete choice model from which we can derive welfare measures, and we calibrate the discrete choice model using known elasticities from the literature. This is a very useful setup for a number of potential policy analyses. In this particular research, we investigate how three types of tariff products are performing. This is a pure public transport subscription, a pure car sharing subscription, and a multimodal subscription, which is valid for both modes. And we will benchmark these products against a differentiated fare policy, where the two directions of the model might have a different fare level to reflect crowding and other costs. What we find here is the following, and let me just highlight the most important results. In the off-peak period, the subscription, no matter if it's a rail, car sharing, or multimodal subscription, manages to reduce car ownership rates and also car use levels to some extent. However, in the opposite direction, what we observe is that the number of car users actually increases, so there is higher congestion, and it was very surprising to realize this at the beginning. We were really trying to understand the underlying mechanics, and the underlying mechanics is here. Rail users, when they don't have the subscription, they experience certain disutility, and when they do have the subscription available, that disutility reduces, so we have more rail users due to the presence of the subscription. However, that increases the level of crowding. And for that reason, those people who do not own the subscription, what they observe is unfortunately an increase in the cost of public transport use to some. So in other words, subscription holders crowd out the remaining users. And in this way, there will be captive subscription holders who will use public transport more intensively, but others who do not decide to buy the subscription, they will observe the same usage-dependent fares with much higher crowding, and therefore they will tend to rely more on their cars, which is exactly the opposite of what MaaS intends to achieve. So these are quite worrying results. If you vary the price of subscriptions, not just introduce it by one price, then there is a clear tendency: the cheaper the subscription, the lower the welfare level, no matter if you consider a pass for only one mode or for multiple modes. Unfortunately, the financial outcome of the story is also following a similar tendency. The cheaper the subscription, the lower the financial result of this MaaS system, which means that more public subsidies will have to be provided to balance the financial outcome. In scenario 4 of the paper, we also investigated what happens if this is fully profit-oriented. So the MaaS operator's objective is to maximize revenues. And what we can observe, and please look at the bottom of this slide, where you have a profit index, which is 0 in a baseline scenario and 1 when you have profit maximizing flat fares. It seems with the subscriptions, you can indeed achieve higher profits than with the flat fares. So having the subscription is useful for the profit-oriented operator. However, the welfare index turns to be negative, which means that the cost of that additional profit is unfortunately lost social welfare. And the reason for that is that the profit-oriented objective doesn't include crowding, congestion, and other externalities, only the financial result. With differentiated pricing, we achieve, again, higher profits than with flat fares. However, the welfare degradation is less severe, which means that if you have a profit-oriented MaaS operator, then you shouldn't allow him or her to offer subscriptions, because society is much better off with differentiated pricing still. So these are the main conclusions of this simple numerical exercise. We have a detailed paper published recently, which explains all the nuanced details of the models. And in the final sections of the paper, we also discuss a couple of things about industrial organization. And I would wrap up this presentation with the conclusions of that discussion. First of all, we have seen in the previous scenarios that the objective function behind supply optimization really depends on whether it is a publicly owned provider or a private operator. So it's a crucial regulatory decision whether the actual MaaS integrator and all the operators under the integrator are public or private companies. And really the outcomes of a policy will depend heavily, and that can be simulated actually and forecast quite reliably. And the second main conclusion is the one where we don't have modeling results yet. However, it might be relevant later on in policy discussions, namely that the way how public and private operators interact with each other can be quite ambiguous sometimes. So the tools of industrial organization and game theory should be adopted to understand how on earth can a public operator compete with a private one when their objectives are absolutely different. So, for example, how they deal with externalities together when the private operator's objective doesn't include anything about externalities. And finally, we also gave a thought to how this analysis could be adopted to COVID-19. Our understanding is that in the present crisis, crowding costs are substantially higher than normally. Even though there is no clear evidence about infection rates within public transport, and masks can help a lot indeed, it is quite obvious that people are afraid, and therefore their crowding cost perception is much higher than normally, which means that this externality is more important than ever, which means that proper incentives in terms of sophisticated pricing methods are also becoming more relevant. And so our view is that having the MaaS concept and all the sophisticated IT solutions, this is essentially an extremely nice opportunity for the public transport industry to move towards more disaggregate pricing methods, because it's easier to explain, to implement and enforce a differentiated pricing system with MaaS than without MaaS. And that also implies that subscriptions, which is essentially the opposite direction, aggregating the tariff system is probably a wrong direction, which will not be able to unlock the full potential of mobility as a service. So with this, I would like to conclude this presentation. I really hope I managed to provide some economic inputs and this way close the gap between the transport economics community who are dealing with all these pricing models for decades. And I think many of their messages might be helpful to fine-tune mobility as a service and to explain and prove its value for society. Thank you.